Imagine being a Soviet fighter pilot in 1941, watching your country burn and your squadrons get destroyed. Then, America sends you their leftovers, a fighter so obsolete that their own pilots are ditching it for anything else. You're basically being sent to your death. Instead, you discover why the Americans built it this way. October 1941, Ivanovo Air Base, Soviet Union. Senior Lieutenant Sergey Ridnyy stood in the freezing rain, staring at a line of strange-looking fighters that had just arrived via the Arctic convoy route. The Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk bore shark-mouth nose art and carried the hopes of British and American planners who believed this Lend-Lease equipment would help stem the German onslaught. Ridnyy wasn't impressed. "This is what the British don't want?" he muttered to his squadron mate. "An aircraft so obsolete they're giving it away?" The P-40B was already considered outdated in 1941. It lacked a supercharger, limiting high-altitude performance. Its Allison V1710 engine produced only 1,040 horsepower, less than the latest Soviet designs. American and British pilots were transitioning to newer aircraft. The P-40 was yesterday's fighter, being dumped on the Soviets because nobody else wanted it. But Ridnyy and thousands of Soviet pilots like him were about to discover something the Western experts had missed. The right aircraft in the right hands, fighting the right war, could defy every expectation. We'll reveal exactly how, but first, let's understand why the Soviets were so desperate and so skeptical. The Soviet Air Force in late 1941 was in catastrophic condition. Operation Barbarossa had destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft in the first weeks of invasion. Modern Soviet fighters like the MiG-3, Yak-1, and Le GG-3 existed, but in insufficient numbers with severe teething problems. Frontline units were still flying obsolete IR-16 and I-153 biplanes against modern German Bf-109Fs. The Lend-Lease program offered a lifeline, but Soviet pilots viewed foreign equipment with deep suspicion. Soviet aviation culture was intensely nationalistic. Pilots believed Soviet designs were superior because Soviet propaganda told them so constantly. The idea that they needed foreign aircraft to defend the motherland was humiliating. The P-40 seemed to confirm their worst fears about Western incompetence. Major Lev Shestakov, assigned to evaluate the first P-40 shipment, filed a scathing initial report. "The aircraft is obsolete by Western standards, which is presumably why the British are willing to part with it. It lacks supercharger, limiting altitude performance to below 15,000 feet. The engine produces less power than our MiG-3. The aircraft is heavier than our fighters with no apparent performance advantage. Build quality is good, but this merely means it is well-constructed obsolescence." The technical specifications seem to support this dismissal. The P-40B weighed 7,600 pounds, loaded compared to 5,700 pounds for an I-16 or 6,800 pounds for a Yak-1. Maximum speed was 352 miles per hour at optimal altitude, respectable but not exceptional. Rate of climb was mediocre. Turn radius was poor compared to Soviet fighters optimized for maneuverability. Most damningly, the P-40B's Allison engine lost power rapidly above 12,000 feet. German fighters on the Eastern Front typically held altitude advantage, diving down to attack. An aircraft that couldn't fight effectively above 15,000 feet seemed useless for the defensive battles the Soviets were fighting. But there was one specification that nobody paid much attention to initially. The P-40 was tough. Really tough. How tough? Hang on, you're about to find out, and it would change everything. The P-40's construction was massively overbuilt by Soviet standards. The airframe was stressed to withstand 12 G-loads, far beyond anything Soviet fighters could survive. The Allison engine sat in a robust mounting that could absorb tremendous punishment. Self-sealing fuel tanks were standard. The cockpit armor was thicker than Soviet fighters carried. The aircraft was designed to American standards of ruggedness, which meant it was designed to bring pilots home alive, even when things went catastrophically wrong. Soviet pilots didn't appreciate this initially because Soviet design philosophy was different. Soviet fighters were built light to maximize performance, accepting fragility as necessary compromise. Pilots were expected to avoid damage through superior maneuvering. The idea of building an aircraft specifically to survive battle damage seemed wasteful, evidence of American overcaution rather than sensible engineering. Lieutenant Nikolai Gerasimov expressed the common view during conversion training. The Americans build aircraft like tanks. Heavy, overbuilt, obsessed with protection, we build aircraft like swords, light, fast, deadly. The P-40 represents American philosophy of avoiding risk. Soviet philosophy is accepting risk to achieve victory. I would rather fly a light, fast yak than this armored truck. The conversion training proceeded slowly through November and December 1941. Soviet pilots found the P-40 heavy on the controls compared to their fighters. The visibility was poor. The long nose blocked forward view during taxiing and takeoff. The aircraft required more runway than Soviet fighters. The cockpit was spacious but overly complex with too many gauges and controls. American advisors tried to explain proper P-40 tactics, but the language barrier and cultural differences created confusion. The Americans emphasized diving attacks, speed management, and avoiding sustained dogfights. Soviet pilots, trained in aggressive turning combat, found this approach cowardly and un-Soviet. Real pilots faced the enemy directly, they believed, not ran away after single passes. The 126th Fighter Aviation Regiment received the first combat-ready P-40s in December 1941 and was committed to action defending Moscow. Soviet command expected poor results. The regiment was essentially a test unit, determining whether P-40s were worth deploying in larger numbers or should be relegated to training duties. The first mission was assigned for December 16, 1941. Captain Sergey Ridnyy led 6 P-40s on patrol over Soviet lines west of Moscow. Nobody expected much. What happened next would begin changing minds, though slowly at first. But before we see what happened, let me ask you, what makes an obsolete fighter suddenly effective? Stay tuned. The answer will surprise you. The December 16th mission began typically. Ridny's flight patrolled at 10,000 feet, an altitude where the P-40's engine still produced reasonable power. The temperature was minus 30 degrees Celsius. Soviet fighters often had engine problems in extreme cold. The Allison engine, designed for American conditions, ran smoothly, one unexpected advantage nobody had anticipated. Contact with German aircraft came at 14:30 hours. 4 Bf-109 F-2s appeared at 13,000 feet, diving to attack a Soviet reconnaissance aircraft below Ridny's flight. This was exactly the tactical situation where the P-40 was supposed to fail. German fighters with altitude advantage, better performance, and experienced pilots. Ridny's combat report describes what happened. I observed 4 109s diving past us toward the reconnaissance aircraft. Standard Soviet doctrine would be to climb and engage. I remembered the American advisor saying the P-40 cannot climb with 109s. Instead, I dove after them, accepting we would not catch them before they attacked our aircraft, but perhaps we could catch them during their recovery. The 109s attacked the reconnaissance aircraft and overshot, pulling up to regain altitude. My flight had built significant speed in our dive. We were at 450 kilometers per hour when we intercepted them during their climb. I selected the trailing 109 and fired from 200 meters, 6.50 caliber guns. The Americans had stressed the firepower advantage. I fired a 3-second burst. The effect was immediate and devastating. Strikes covered the 109's fuselage and wing root. Pieces separated. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell. The other 3 109s scattered. One turned hard left, attempting to engage me in turning combat. I did not follow his turn, another point the Americans had emphasized. The P-40 cannot turn with a 109. Instead, I dove away, building speed. The 109 pilot pursued but couldn't close. The P-40 accelerates in a dive unlike any Soviet fighter I've flown. Within seconds, I had extended beyond his effective range. I pulled up, regained altitude using speed advantage, and repositioned. 2 of my squadron mates had engaged the other 109s with similar tactics. We claimed 2 destroyed, 1 probable, 0 losses. The mission seemed almost anticlimactic. No dramatic dogfighting, no desperate maneuvering, just systematic application of speed and firepower. But the implications were profound. Soviet pilots had achieved positive results against the Luftwaffe, using tactics completely foreign to Soviet doctrine and using an aircraft they'd dismissed as obsolete. Major Shestakov, observing the mission, filed a revised assessment. The P-40 achieved successful results when flown according to American tactical doctrine rather than Soviet methods. This requires explanation. Soviet fighter tactics emphasize maneuverability and aggressive turning combat. The P-40 is unsuited for these tactics. American doctrine emphasizes speed maintenance, diving attacks, and disengagement before sustained combat begins. The P-40 is well suited for these tactics. But one successful mission didn't convince the skeptics. Most Soviet pilots still believed the P-40 was inferior. That attitude was about to change dramatically. Don't go anywhere. We're about to see the mission that made believers out of cynics. The mission that changed Soviet perceptions of the P-40 came on January 8, 1942. Lieutenant Nikolai Gerasimov, the same pilot who had called the P-40 an armored truck, was flying lone patrol in terrible weather when he encountered 8 Bf-109s escorting a reconnaissance flight. The tactical situation was impossible by Soviet standards, 8 against 1 over enemy territory in an aircraft Gerasimov considered inferior. Standard doctrine demanded immediate withdrawal, but Gerasimov had been studying American tactical manuals and decided to try something unconventional. His after-action report is remarkable. I had altitude advantage, 15,000 feet to their 12,000. The Americans say the P-40 is a diving fighter. I'd never really understood what this meant. I dove on the rear 109 from above and behind. My speed increased rapidly. At 600 kilometers per hour, I fired from 150 meters. Concentrated firepower from 6 guns destroyed the 109 instantly. I continued my dive past the formation, extending to 8,000 feet before pulling up. The Germans were confused. They couldn't see where the attack came from. I climbed back to 16,000 feet using speed from the dive. The Americans were right. The P-40 converts speed to altitude very efficiently. I positioned above them again and dove on another 109. Same result. This time they saw me, and 3 109s turned to engage. I didn't turn with them. I dove away again, extended, climbed, repositioned. I repeated this pattern 5 times. Each time I dove, attacked, extended, climbed, repositioned. The Germans couldn't counter it. They couldn't climb with me because I was using speed energy. They couldn't catch me in dives. They couldn't force turning combat because I refused to engage. After my 5th pass, they withdrew. I had damaged 3 aircraft severely and forced an entire German formation to abandon their mission. 1 P-40 against 8 109s. This should have been suicide. Instead, I survived without a single hit on my aircraft. Gerasimov landed and immediately requested a meeting with his regimental commander. His assessment had completely reversed. I was wrong about this aircraft. The P-40 is not obsolete. It is specialized. It is a diving fighter designed for specific tactics that exploit specific advantages. When flown correctly, it is extremely effective. When flown incorrectly, using Soviet turning tactics, it is suicidal. We need to retrain the entire regiment in American doctrine immediately. The transformation in Soviet attitudes toward the P-40 accelerated rapidly through early 1942 as more pilots experienced success using American boom and zoom tactics. But the real revelation came when pilots discovered the P-40's most important characteristic, one that couldn't be measured in specifications. What was it? Stick around. This is where the story gets really interesting. The P-40's defining characteristic emerged through accumulated combat experience. It was almost impossible to kill. Soviet pilots began returning from missions with battle damage that would have destroyed any Soviet fighter. Aircraft landed with entire sections of wing shot away, with holes through fuselages, with destroyed control surfaces, and pilots walked away unharmed. Guards, Lieutenant Sergey Ridnyy, no relation to Sergey, survived an encounter that illustrated the P-40's legendary toughness. On February 3, 1942, he was jumped by 4 Bf-10-9s while escorting an Il-2 formation at low altitude. Caught at disadvantageous position, he took multiple hits before escaping. I felt impacts across my aircraft, Cannon shells and machine gun fire hitting wings, fuselage, engine. My cockpit filled with smoke. Oil sprayed across the windscreen. I thought I was dead, his report stated, but the engine kept running. The controls still responded. I dove for ground level and flew home at maximum speed. The 109s pursued but couldn't catch me. Even with severe damage, the P-40 was faster than they expected. I landed successfully. Ground crew counted 37 separate hits on my aircraft. 14 were cannon shells, 20 millimeters and smaller. 23 were machine gun strikes. The engine had been hit 6 times. 3 cylinders were destroyed, but the engine continued running. The wing had been hit 17 times. Fabric was shredded, but structure remained intact. The fuselage showed multiple penetrations, but none reached the cockpit area due to armor protection. In any Soviet fighter I have flown, 3 of these hits would have been fatal. In the P-40, they were repairable damage. The American engineers built this aircraft assuming it would be hit and designed it to survive. This is not overcaution. This is recognition that combat involves being shot at, and keeping pilots alive matters more than saving weight. The psychological impact of this survivability was transformative. Soviet pilots flying I-16s, MiGs, or even newer Yaks lived with constant awareness that any hit could be fatal. Pilots flew carefully, disengaged early, avoided risks. P-40 pilots discovered they could press attacks, accept risks, and survive mistakes that would kill them in other aircraft. Guards Major Lev Shestakov, who had initially dismissed the P-40 as obsolete, flew the aircraft for 6 months and recorded his transformed assessment. The P-40 has changed how I think about fighter design. Soviet doctrine emphasizes not being hit through superior maneuverability. American doctrine accepts that you will be hit and designs aircraft to keep you alive when it happens. After flying the P-40, I believe the American approach is superior for sustained combat operations. But there was one environment where the P-40 truly excelled, and it wasn't where anyone expected. Keep watching. We're about to reveal the mission type that made the P-40 legendary. The P-40's greatest success in Soviet service came in a role nobody had anticipated: ground attack escort and low-altitude combat. The aircraft's limitations at high altitude didn't matter at treetop level. Its ruggedness made it ideal for the dangerous environment near the ground, where anti-aircraft fire and small arms could destroy lighter fighters. The breakthrough came during the Demyansk pocket operations in February-March 1942. German forces were surrounded near Demyansk and being supplied by air. Soviet fighters needed to intercept German transport aircraft flying low-level supply missions while protecting their own Il-2 Sturmovix attacking German positions. This environment, low-altitude, heavy anti-aircraft fire, requirement to fly close escort, was perfect for the P-40. The 126th and 436th Fighter Aviation Regiments, both equipped with P-40s, were assigned to these operations with dramatic results. Captain Sergey Ridnyy led missions that established the template for P-40 employment. His description captures why the aircraft excelled. "We fly at 1,000 meters, escorting Sturmovix to target. German flak is heavy, shells exploding constantly around us. Soviet fighters at this altitude with this flak would suffer terrible losses. The P-40 survives. Aircraft return with flak damage but fly normally. The rugged construction saves lives constantly. German fighters attempt to intercept us at low altitude. They have no advantage here. The P-40's engine performs well below 3,000 meters, where their supercharged engines offer no benefit. We engage them with speed and firepower advantages. The 6.50 caliber guns are devastating against German aircraft. A 2-second burst is usually sufficient to destroy or severely damage any aircraft. Most importantly, we can protect the Sturmovix effectively because we're not afraid of damage. Soviet fighters must avoid flak and break off early. P-40 pilots can stay with the Sturmovix through the entire attack because we know our aircraft will survive the defensive fire. This allows us to prevent German fighters from attacking the vulnerable ground attack aircraft. The results were quantifiable and impressive. Between February and April 1942, P-40 equipped regiments in the Demyansk sector recorded 186 confirmed victories against 23 aircraft lost. an 8-to-1 ratio that exceeded anything achieved by Soviet fighters in similar operations. More significantly, Sturmovik losses dropped by 40% when escorted by P-40 compared to Soviet fighter escorts. The success generated demand for more P-40s. Soviet command, initially skeptical, began requesting additional shipments. By mid-1942, over 2,000 P-40s of various models were serving in Soviet units, and the aircraft had gained grudging respect throughout the Red Air Force. But respect didn't mean love. Soviet pilots still found things to complain about. What were the P-40's persistent problems? Don't miss this. Some of these flaws were truly bizarre. The P-40's limitations in Soviet service were real and sometimes dangerous. The most critical issue was cold weather performance. The Allison engine, designed for temperate climates, struggled in Russian winters. At temperatures below -30°C, engines refused to start without elaborate preheating. Oil congealed, coolant froze despite antifreeze. Hydraulic systems failed. Soviet ground crews developed improvised solutions that would horrify American engineers. They lit fires under engine cowlings to warm the oil. They drained coolant overnight and refilled it before missions. They developed elaborate tents that enclosed entire aircraft, heated by wood stoves. These expedients worked but were labor-intensive and sometimes dangerous. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Semenov recorded a particularly absurd incident. We attempted to start my P-40 for a scramble mission. Temperature was -38°C. Engine refused to start despite ground crew having preheated it for an hour. We were ordered to launch immediately. German bombers inbound. Ground crew brought a second wood stove and placed it directly against the engine cowling. After 20 minutes, the engine finally started. I took off 40 minutes late. The mission was over. The Germans had bombed and departed. We needed those fighters in the air, but the aircraft couldn't function in conditions where our own fighters worked fine. The cockpit heating was inadequate for Russian winters. Pilots flew with multiple layers of clothing, fur boots, heavy gloves. The thick gloves made operating the numerous American switches and controls difficult. Pilots complained constantly about freezing during long missions. Visibility remained problematic. The long nose blocked forward view during ground operations. Soviet pilots, accustomed to fighters with excellent visibility, found this frustrating and occasionally dangerous. Several P-40s were damaged in taxiing accidents when pilots couldn't see obstacles ahead. Maintenance complexity was another persistent issue. American fighters had sophisticated systems that Soviet ground crews struggled to maintain. Technical manuals were in English and poorly translated. Spare parts were sometimes unavailable. Soviet ground crews were accustomed to simple, maintainable Soviet fighters. The P-40 required specialist knowledge and tools that weren't always available at forward airfields. Despite these problems, Soviet pilots increasingly preferred the P-40 for certain missions. The aircraft had found its niche: low to medium altitude combat, ground attack escort, and any mission where survivability mattered more than pure performance. But the question remained: was the P-40 actually a good fighter or just adequate? The answer came from an unexpected source. Stay tuned. We're about to hear from the Germans themselves. Luftwaffe assessments of the P-40 in Soviet service provide fascinating perspective. German intelligence compiled reports from pilots who encountered P-40s on the Eastern Front, and their conclusions contradicted the Western narrative of the P-40 as an obsolete failure. A Luftwaffe intelligence summary from July 1942, captured after the war, stated, "Soviet forces are employing American-built P-40 fighters in increasing numbers. These aircraft are proving more effective than anticipated. Soviet pilots are flying them aggressively, particularly at low to medium altitudes, where the aircraft's performance is adequate and its ruggedness provides significant advantage." The P-40's concentrated firepower, 6.50 caliber machine guns, is extremely dangerous. Pilots report that brief bursts from P-40s cause severe damage. The aircraft's ability to absorb battle damage is notable. Multiple reports describe P-40s escaping after receiving hits that would destroy Soviet fighters. This survivability allows Soviet pilots to press attacks more aggressively. Recommendation: P-40S should be engaged cautiously and only with tactical advantage. The aircraft cannot be outturned, but attempting to force turning combat is dangerous due to heavy armament. The P-40's diving speed is substantial. Pursuit during disengagement is often unsuccessful. Damaged P-40s should not be assumed destroyed as the aircraft frequently survives severe damage. This German assessment, treating the P-40 as a capable opponent requiring tactical caution, stands in stark contrast to American and British evaluations that dismissed the aircraft as obsolete. The difference suggests that the P-40's effectiveness depended heavily on tactical employment and operational environment. Soviet ace Alexander Pokryshkin, who flew P-40s early in his career before transitioning to P-39s, provided analysis that explained this paradox. The P-40 is not obsolete, it is specialized. Western air forces fight at high altitude against bombers and fighters optimized for altitude performance. In that environment, the P-40 is inferior. On the Eastern Front, most combat occurs below 4,000 meters. We fight ground attack missions, escort duties, and defensive battles against German fighters that dive to attack. In this environment, the P-40's strengths matter and its weaknesses are irrelevant. The aircraft that seems obsolete in England is effective in Russia because the tactical requirements are different. This is the lesson. Aircraft effectiveness cannot be evaluated abstractly. It depends on the specific tactical environment and operational requirements. The P-40 is a good fighter for the war we're actually fighting, even if it would be inadequate for the war the British and Americans are fighting. So what was the final verdict on the P-40? Hang in there. We're about to reveal the statistics that tell the real story. By the time P-40 deliveries to the Soviet Union ended in 1944, over 2,400 aircraft of various models had been delivered. Soviet P-40 units compiled impressive combat records that vindicated the aircraft's effectiveness in its specialized role. The 126th Fighter Aviation Regiment, the first Soviet unit to operate P-40s, recorded 537 confirmed victories between December 1941 and June 1943 while losing 86 P-40s in combat, a ratio of 6.2 to 1. The 436th Regiment achieved 428 victories against 73 losses, 5.9 to 1. The 154th Regiment recorded 311 victories against 61 losses, 5.1 to 1. These ratios were comparable to or better than Soviet fighters operating in similar roles during the same period. More significantly, pilot survival rates in P-40 units were substantially higher than in units flying Soviet fighters. The P-40's ruggedness translated directly into saved lives. Individual Soviet pilots achieved remarkable success in P-40. Alexander Pokryshkin scored 20 of his eventual 59 victories in P-40s. Nikolai Gerasimov, the pilot who had initially scorned the aircraft, recorded 34 victories flying P-40s and survived the war. Sergey Ridnyy achieved 28 victories in P-40s before transitioning to Yak-9s in late 1943. Soviet assessments of the P-40 evolved from dismissive to respectful. A Red Air Force analysis from late 1943 concluded, the P-40 has proven effective in Soviet service when employed in roles matching its capabilities. The aircraft is well suited for low to medium altitude combat, ground attack escort, and missions where aircraft survivability is critical. It is less suitable for high-altitude combat or missions requiring superior maneuverability. The P-40's greatest value has been in keeping experienced pilots alive. Soviet fighters achieve good combat results but suffer high pilot casualty rates due to fragility. P-40 pilots survive combat damage that would be fatal in Soviet aircraft. This allows experienced pilots to accumulate victories and train newer pilots, a critical advantage in sustained operations. But there's one more chapter to this story. What happened after the war? Stay with me for the surprising conclusion. The post-war fate of P-40s in Soviet service was swift and ignominious. As newer American fighters arrived via Lend-Lease, P-30s, P-60s, eventually P-40s, and as Soviet production of Yaks-3 and Yaks-9 accelerated, P-40s were rapidly withdrawn from frontline service. By late 1944, few remained in combat units. Most were relegated to training duties or scrapped. The political narrative around Lend-Lease equipment became complicated after the war. Soviet propaganda minimized foreign contributions to victory, emphasizing Soviet self-reliance and the superiority of Soviet designs. Pilots who had flown American fighters were sometimes viewed suspiciously as having been contaminated by Western influence. Guards Major Lev Shestakov found his post-war career complicated by his association with American aircraft. After the war, there was pressure to emphasize that Soviet fighters won the air war. The fact that I had scored many victories in an American aircraft was inconvenient. I was instructed to minimize discussions of the P-40's effectiveness and to attribute my success to Soviet training and tactics rather than aircraft quality. This was dishonest. The P-40 was a good fighter that saved my life repeatedly. It wasn't perfect, it had real limitations in cold weather and high altitude, but it was effective in the role we needed, and it was far more survivable than Soviet fighters. Denying this for political reasons doesn't change the historical truth. Most Soviet pilots who flew P-40s maintained privately that the aircraft had been effective and appreciated, even as official narratives dismissed Lend-Lease contributions. Lieutenant Nikolai Gerasimov, in memoirs published in the 1990s after the Soviet Union collapsed, wrote, "The P-40 taught us that American engineering philosophy had merit. They built aircraft to protect pilots, not just to achieve maximum performance. This was alien to Soviet thinking, but it worked. The pilots who survived the war in P-40 survived partly because American engineers valued pilot survival as much as combat capability." The broader lesson of the P-40 and Soviet service challenges conventional narratives about the aircraft. In American and British historiography, the P-40 is typically portrayed as an obsolete failure, a stopgap fighter inferior to German and Japanese opponents, relegated to secondary theaters because it couldn't compete in Europe. But Soviet experience suggests a different conclusion. The P-40 was a specialized fighter that performed effectively in the specific tactical environment of the Eastern Front. It wasn't a world-beating superfighter, but it was a capable, survivable aircraft that achieved good results when employed properly. The aircraft that Soviet pilots laughed at in October 1941 became one of the war's unsung success stories. Not through dramatic technical superiority or overwhelming performance, but through the unglamorous virtues of ruggedness, reliability, and the to keep pilots alive through missions where lighter, faster fighters would have failed. Final assessment? The P-40 wasn't the best fighter of World War II, it wasn't even close, but in Soviet hands, fighting the specific war the Soviets needed to fight, it was good enough. And in war, good enough in the right place at the right time can be more valuable than technical excellence in the wrong role. The transformation from mockery to respect took months. Soviet pilots began the war believing Soviet design philosophy was superior, that foreign equipment was inferior, that light maneuverable fighters were the only correct approach. The P-40 challenged every assumption. It proved that different tactical environments require different solutions, that survivability can matter more than performance, and that the obsolete fighter rejected by Western air forces could be effective where it matched operational requirements. If this story of unexpected success in design philosophy transformed by combat reality captivated you, hit that subscribe button now for more untold stories from history's greatest battles. Don't miss out on the next revelation.